or closest to the earliest humans on the planet. We now have looked at they have this click language. They're talking clicks. People have now analyzed these clicks. What they are, they're consonants. There's no vowels. So this group is so culturally primitive that it still has a language way before the invention of the vowel that was invented to separate consonants and make everything more understandable. So this is a really early population. And it's a remnant population now, and so you could argue that, you know, they've been only the low IQ group remains. But it's perfectly reasonable that the Kalahari Bushmen are the most earliest versions of humans left on Earth. So the Australian Aborigines and the Kalahari Bushmen may be much more primitive. The Australian Aborigines look much more primitive, if I can use that word, than black Africans. They have much bigger jaws. You can see that they have a much narrow skull with indentations, huge brow ridges, and of course they have a lower IQ than Africans.
Philippe, the explanation of high IQ being generated by coping with cold winters you mentioned earlier, wouldn't that cause the folks, the villagers in Greenland and the Aleutians to have higher IQs? How does that work with?
Yes, well, there are, I'm glad I put it in the context of Darwin, this idea, but there are little anomalies, little things that don't quite fit. And I'm sorry to say that there are more than one or two little pieces in all this data that don't quite fit, and that's one of them. Richard Lynn's best shot at giving an explanation in his book is that you don't just need the genetic mutation for the higher IQ, you also need a sufficiently large population base that it can spread. So he thinks that the Greenland Eskimos do have a bigger brain, they do have the colder environment, and they do have a much higher IQ, by the way, than the American Indians. It's like 90 or 91 compared to 83 or 84. But it's much lower than whites.
Professor, a couple of years ago, Tom Wolfe wrote an article, and I was thinking about it while you were talking in Forbes, talking about that there was an IQ cap or something that they were talking about where a person would measure the electrical activity in the brain, sort of like an EEG or something like that, I suppose, and that by looking at a dot on the wall, they could accurately measure IQ, and by doing that, there's obviously no cultural derivative at looking at that on the wall. Whatever became of that? I never heard any further.
Well, it's a promissory note, but this will be the next generation of IQ tests. The idea is that the intelligent brains are incredibly efficient brains, so they process information much faster. So all you really have to do is, say, shine a light into somebody's eye. At the same time, you're measuring the speed with which that shows up at the back of the head. So it's like microseconds, milliseconds, split second going from the eye to the back of the head. But some nerves will conduct it slightly faster than other ones, and that this will be a measure of IQ. So this is the big promissory note, and there's a lot of drug company money and so on going into it, because it's going to be a good indicator of Alzheimer's and dementia. It's an early warning sign. So there's a lot of beneficial effects. So people are looking at this, but it's not here yet.
The last few times that I've talked with Professor Kevin MacDonald, he's been working on the interesting question of a disconnect between physiological responses, the gene pool assorting for similarity, and cognitive levels that are in complete conflict or in strong conflict with the physiological. So for example, someone shown a picture of a mixed race couple shows physiological responses to that are of fear or anxiety. Then asked cognitively, how do you feel about this picture? They say, I feel fine. And are you doing any work in that area of a disconnect between cognitive, which perhaps programmed behavior, and physiological response?
I'm not as familiar with that information as I should be, but basically the idea is, again, that we'll be able to measure the way the brain functions and see how prejudiced people are, or what you're thinking more generally. What are you thinking? What are you feeling? We don't need to rely on what you say. We can just look into the brain and see or infer it from what's measured. And this, too, is a promissory note just around the corner.
Yeah, I have the feeling that he's got a big book cooking on that exact topic.
There are many research labs doing it. And you know, when do people lie? I mean, there's a whole bunch of research on lie detection. So this is tapping into that. Let's look into the brain and see whether he's lying or not. Even in psychoanalysis and psychotherapy, you know, are people deceiving themselves? Do they really not know that they're schizophrenic, or are they just pretending they're not, or whatever? And so even in that kind of medical research, so there's a lot of that kind of work going on. I'm sorry, I'm just not very familiar with the particulars. I know it's there. It's on my list of things to do. The Flynn effect. This is a very good question, and it's very pertinent because I'm writing a paper on it right now. Jim Flynn is a very well-known New Zealand political scientist who's weighed in on the black-white IQ differences. He is probably now the single best, most credible person on the culture-only theory. And he's attacked Jensen and me, as a matter of fact. He's got a paper in press, and Jensen and I are now replying to it. What Flynn has found is that over the last 30 or 40 years, IQ scores appear to be rising. So if you go to the Dutch army, they've been given the same IQ test to their recruits ever since 1945. And so we find that, in fact, Dutch army scores have been going up slightly. All this time, about 3 IQ points every 10 years. It's not slightly, it's quite a lot. In the psychological literature, we know this is true because IQ tests have to be renormed every 10 or 15 years. So we recognize the phenomenon. People are getting smarter. Or at least they're doing better on the tests. So what the Flynn effect is, nobody really knows, but the increase in scores has been occurring. What Flynn says is that it's all due to better nutrition, better education, better television, more stimulating world. We're all getting smarter. And black kids are getting smarter, and white kids are getting smarter, and you don't need any genetic explanations at all. Furthermore, he argues in this most recent paper, the black-white gap is narrowing. If you look at IQ tests, it's narrowed, he claims, by 4 to 7 IQ points over the last 30 years, since 1970. And therefore, Rushton's claims that it's 80% heritable and that these IQ scores are consistent over the world and consistent over time is just hogwash, he says. Our reply is twofold. One, the cause of the rise, whatever it is, and it's reliable, we analyze some data and we show that it is reliable, it is increasing. But the causes of the black-white differences are in a different quadrant from the causes of the Flynn effect rise. So whatever is causing the Flynn effect to rise, and maybe it's an artifact, it is not the cause of the black-white difference. And the second thing, it gets technical of course, the second thing is Flynn, even though he's the most honest broker on that side, seems to us to have absolutely cherry-picked these 3 tests that he claims shows the narrowing of the black-white